What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Salt and Pauper video. My name's Chad, and we are going to continue our Beating the Meta series with episode 3. This time we're going to look at the boogeyman of the format. That's right, we're going to take a look at Grixis Affinity. It just recently won the Pauper Challenge this last weekend while I was at Magic 30, so it's about time we tackled it. I'm a big player of this deck, so I know the deck really, really well. Hopefully, those of you who are struggling against it, you get some tips for how to beat it next week. Let's jump right in. Taking a look at this deck, the list has remained largely unchanged over the last few weeks, so it shouldn't be any surprise what's in here. There are a few flex slots, and we'll go over those as we look at the deck. But just before we dive into things, a quick apology. My voice is a little hoarse. I was really sick after Magic 30. It was an awesome weekend, and there'll be a recap video coming soon. But until then, while I'm recovering, I just wanted to get you guys out a video this week and really take a look at this dominant deck. So I apologize. I'll probably be clearing my throat a lot. For those of you that don't like that sound, I do apologize, but I can't really help it. All right, starting off, the deck shouldn't be too big of a surprise, but we have as many artifact lands as we can fit. Most decks run between 18 and 20 artifact lands. My current paper version runs 19. That's the list that we're going to be taking a look at. I am a frequent Affinity player. I've been playing it for a long time, and while my list may be slightly off of the last deck that won, i.e. missing Frogmites, I'm pretty happy with how the deck has been playing and the adjustments I've made, and we'll go over why I made those when we get there. But to start off, looking at those 19 lands, primarily this is a black-blue deck, so we're going to start off with full 4s of Vault of Whispers and Seed of the Synod, followed by 3 Great Furnace as the red splash. And then we have 3 Drossforce Bridge, which is the red-black bridge. We have 3 Mist Vault Bridge, which is the blue-black bridge, and 2 of the Silver Bluff Bridge being the blue-red. We kick off the instants and sorceries with a 4 of in the Galvanic Blast. This is your deck's primary reach and removal spell. If you're not familiar with it, it's a Metalcraft spell. It deals 2 damage unless you have 3 or more artifacts, and then it deals 4 damage at instant for 1 red. It's just better Lightning Bolt in this deck all the time. We have our 4 of Chromatic Stars. This is going to be part of the Deadly Dispute value engine. And then we have 3 Blood Fountains. Now, Blood Fountain used to be a 4 of in this deck. It was really helpful at landing turn 2 Thought Casts and really early Metallic Rebuke threats just to keep your artifact count high very quickly. However, in the late game, this card becomes largely redundant, and while the blood tokens are helpful and can be sacrificed to a host of things for value, you usually only need 1 or 2 of these, so we've cut it down to 3 to make room for some flex slots. Starting the 2-drops, we start off with one of the best cards in Pauper, a full 4 Deadly Disputes. This lets you sacrifice a creature or an artifact to draw 2 cards and get a treasure token, as well as 4 cards we're going to be sacrificing to those Deadly Disputes. Ichor Wellsprings, which is a 2-mana artifact. When it enters play or dies, you draw a card. So in combination with your Chromatic Stars, you have 8 value artifacts to sacrifice to your Deadly Disputes. That's going to make it draw 3 and get 1 mana back. So a lot of people are calling it Black Ancestral Recall. We also have 3 Reckoner's Bargains. Now, I've seen lists going down to 2 of these, and I don't think that is the play, mainly with the popularity of red. Reckoner's Bargain is one of your main stabilizing tools in that matchup. You need that life gain. Reckoner's Bargain lets you also sacrifice an artifact or a creature, except instead of getting a treasure, you draw 2 cards and you gain life equal to its CMC. So obviously you can see Myr Enforcer and Gurmag Angler sitting over in that 7 slot. Those are going to be your biggest targets to stabilize against the red decks, and it really does swing the tempo. You have 2 Makeshift Munitions. This is an artifact that lets you pay 1 mana, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, and ping any target for 1 damage. This is going to be a big source of reach and inevitability in this game. It's also a huge insurance policy against things like Cawgate and Mono Black Foods. It does also help you pick up a lot of those Goblin tokens against the Koldatha red deck, which is big. And many things right now just have a lot of 1/1 flyers and things like that that you want to pick off. This is going to help a lot with that. It also can help you trade into the Turbo Terror, as well as like the opposing Gurmag Anglers coming out of Mono Black, as well as Black Blue. If you have to chump with your Myr Enforcer, or you can threat of activate when attacking with your Myr Enforcers, useful to know that helps you kind of trade up here. Then we enter our first flex slot, which is 2 pieces. I have 1 Terminate, 1 Chainer's Edict. Obviously, Chainer's Edict and 2 more out of the sideboard. That's going to be your big piece against Turbo Terror to deal with those Gurmag Anglers and those Tolarian Terrors. And then we have a Singleton Terminate. This is largely just insurance against Guardian of the Guild Pact, which outside of your Metallic Rebukes, you have very little ways to deal with. Myr Enforcer does help. You can block. Obviously, your lands, when you animate them with Kenku Artificer, can block as well. But this just gives you a fallback plan for that. Moving into the 3 slot, we have 2 Kenku Artificers. This card is busted. It is a 2 colorless and a blue drop Kenku Artificer. It is a 1/1, but when it enters play, you can animate target non-creature artifact, and it gains 3 1/1 counters and flying ability. That's it. Not until Kenku leaves play permanently. Now, the primary target for these is usually going to be one of your bridges, largely because they are indestructible, which means you now have an indestructible 3/3 flyer. That is incredibly good at stalling out a lot of board states, especially because you can get more than one of them. You recycle these through blood fountains, you can keep animating other bridges, and all of a sudden you've got a huge flying force that's very, very difficult to deal with. The other 3 of slot is 2 more flex slots. I run a full 4 Metallic Rebukes. This is an improvised counterspell. It's a 3 mana instant, a blue and 2 colorless, but it has improvise, which means that you can tap artifacts to help pay those colorless costs. So 1 blue and 2 tapped artifacts, you can counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. I've seen decks running down to 2 of these in order to fit in a couple of Frogmites in this slot. Largely in my play experience with the deck, I side out the Frogmites. I just don't think they're all that good right now. They match up very, very poorly into the majority of the metagame. Too many things are swinging with too many things that are bigger than Frogmite, and I would rather just fast power myself into those Myr Enforcers, Gurmag Anglers, and land those Kenkus. The artifact hate out of this metagame is actually at a huge high, and the 4 of Metallic Rebukes do help defend against that as well, so it gives you some resiliency here. I have 3 Thoughtcasts, contrary to the popular 4 of Thoughtcasts. That's mainly just to allow 1 more of the flex slots, as well as it was honestly the worst draw spell in the deck. Most of the time you're playing Deadly Disputes, you're sacking your stars, you're playing your Wellsprings, you're going to have lots of card draw from this deck. Anyway, the Thoughtcasts were largely redundant, although you do have the very cool line of being able to Blood Fountain on 1 or 2 after a tapped land, play an untapped blue source, and then Thoughtcast for 1 on turn 2, which always feels good. But outside of that, really, they're just a refill card, and you already have 7 of them at instant speed plus artifacts, so you don't really need a full 4 of here. Gurmag Angler takes up one of the 7 slots as a 2 of. I've seen a lot of decks cutting down to 1. Again, I think that because this deck, or at least my version of this deck, lacks Frogmites, you do have a little bit of a light creature base, and you need the extra Gurmag Angler here as a late game threat. And then the 4 Myr Enforcers round things out. Taking a quick look at the sideboard, it's mostly standard. You're going to have your Hydroblast, you're going to have your Red Elemental Blast, or your Pyroblast, depending on what you've got access to. You have a Turnicide here, you've got an Electrickery, you've got a couple Gorilla Shamans, a couple Nihil Spellbombs, and a couple Chainer's Edicts. The Hydroblasts and Red Elemental Blasts or Pyroblasts are always going to come in when they're relevant. They are just super efficient counterspells into matchups that you need them. Electrickery here, which is going to be your Fairy, Bird, Cat, and Elves insurance policy. There is the new card out of Dominaria United that allows you to deal 1 damage to each creature your opponent controls, destroy an artifact, or destroy a creature with Defender, which is also very good and can be ran in this slot, but it's a sorcery, so Electrickery being an instant just gives it kind of an edge there. The Gorilla Shamans, obviously you want those in the mirror match, but they're also quite good against things like Called Off the Synthesizer, as well as some of the other decks that are running artifact lands. 4 Galvanic Blasts. They help you control your opponent's land base in those matchups, as well as the mirror matchups. Obviously, you're going to bring those in. Nihil Spell Bombs are good in a couple of matchups. They're good against Tron. They're good against Turbo Fog. They're good against this matchup, which we'll get into later. Affinity is a graveyard-based control deck these days. They're also quite good against the Turbo Terror deck, which is what our next card is also in for, which is Chainer's Edict. You have 2 more coming in from the side to add to the one in the main against the Terror matchup, because you just want to make sure that they really don't stick any of those early 5/5s against you, because the deck does match up fairly poorly against them. But with counterspells and some indestructible 3/3s to stonewall their non-trampling threats, you should be in a pretty good place. It also helps shore up one of the big weaknesses of this deck, which is Boggles. While you have a lot of removal, almost none of it is sacrificial, so those Chainer Edicts really come into play in that matchup and help you try to take out their early threats while you build up a board state to pressure them with. Getting into what this deck is good against. This deck is very late gamey. It's incredibly resilient to spot removal. Your main threats are artifacts and black creatures, which means that you're going to whiff snuff outs a lot of the time when you stick a Gurmag Angler. Your indestructible lands off of the Kenku Artificer are quite good into things like mono black, snuff out, cast down. All those cards just don't do anything here. There is one thing to be careful of, is that Defile, things that neg, like Agony Warp, can take down one of your animated lands, so keep those options open. Make sure you're looking out for those so that you don't get caught off guard. The deck is incredibly strong. It can ramp out very fast for 4 threats if it makes its land drops, and that's one of the big weaknesses of the deck, is that it is very land drop hungry. Although you can keep pretty slim hands just because of how many cards you're going to draw, you do need to hit your land drops. They are your primary artifact source in order to trigger Affinity. So if you can keep your opponent off land drops, or if you can hit their hand very early or quickly to stop them from hitting consistent land drops after turn 2, the deck does stumble a little bit until it can get rolling and draw out of the stumble. So keep that in mind. That is an angle of attack here. What the deck is weak against, the deck is weak fairly drastically against things like Boggles, as well as some Kuldotha Red or some hardcore burn. Reason being, the deck is a little bit slow at the start. You're running 19 lands, 8 of them, sometimes 9 of them, sometimes 10 of them, depending on your land base, come into play tapped. You're going to have some slow starts. You're going to have a lot of games that look like turn 1 bridge, turn 2 bridge star, turn 3 do something. Right, and it could even be like a Kenku, animate one of your tapped lands, and only have a 1/1 to block. So until turn 4, really, the deck is still in setup mode. So you've got a lot of turns of inactivity that opponents can take advantage of, and decks that come out of the gates with Swift Spear into some burn spells, or set up an early Thermal Alchemist, or get a bunch of goblins out early. Decks that pressure in the air very quickly with some Glint Hawks, Turbo Terrors that really curve out and, snare, or Turbo Terror lists that really curve out and slam a couple of 5/5s on turn 3. The deck will stumble to that kind of pressure. Boggles can really stack up on turn 3. If you go turn 1 into a Boggle, turn 2 into, Ethereal Armor and another Aura or a Rancor, and then turn 3 into an Armadillo or an Ancestral Mask, you can provide a lot of pressure very quickly, and as soon as you're bigger than their blockers, unless they hit that singleton Chainers, you're going to be in really good shape. So the deck suffers against speed, which is why I highlighted those Reckoner's Bargains in the main board being your main stabilizing agent against those decks. If you can get to a point where you can slam a 4/4, back it up with a 3/3 indestructible creature, some chump blockers, maybe a Terminate up or something like that, and then you can sacrifice your 7-drop to a Reckoner's Bargain to gain 7 life, draw a couple of cards, Blood Fountain them back, put them back on the board, you're going to stabilize pretty quickly on top of that, and 7 life is very, very difficult for like the Kuldotha Red lists to come back from. Main angles of attack, like I mentioned, those early few vulnerable turns are big, big windows that most people need to be taking advantage of to beat this deck. but you can target the graveyard. You'll notice that in terms of creatures, you're actually fairly light. You've got 8 main deck creatures. Very similar to the Mardu Synthesizer list. They're relying on Blood Fountain the same way that they're relying on the Omen of the Dead in the Synthesizer list. So you can absolutely fight them on their graveyard to starve them out of creatures, and they will run out of bombs. You have to have a plan to deal with those 3/3 flying lands, of course, but ultimately, if you can out-life gain those, or if you can stonewall them, makeshift munitions and Galv Blasts, unless very, very strong or you're already a little bit chipped down, not really going to be able to have the reach that they need to close out the game a lot of the time. So fighting them in the graveyard is a viable path here, especially if you can get them to commit to a Blood Fountain activation and then discard, say, a Fairy Macabre to get both of their targets. Huge upside for you. Obviously, a ton of decks, especially if you're in white, are running things like Revoke Existence or Dust to Dust. These are huge hits for you. Exiling things in this deck is even better, because then it robs them of the graveyard shenanigans of being able to Blood Fountain. It also stops them from being able to exile them for Gurmag Anglers, so it really just hits them from all angles here. Dust to Dust often in the first 4 turns, hitting 2 lands is very, very difficult to recover from, but it doesn't seal the game 100% right then and there, especially with my version running the 4 Metallic Rebukes. You're going to have a little bit of game left, especially because you need to play around them if they're representing them. Ultimately, the deck is very resilient. It can draw out of a lot of problems. So once you establish pressure, you cannot give them time to recover, or they will just go so deep they out-resource you. And that's something to be aware of in this deck and when you play against it. They have so many draw cards, so many engines that let them draw deeper. They will get themselves out of awkward situations just on raw card advantage. So once you have the edge, you really cannot afford to let up on the gas. Make sure you are constantly pressuring this deck, making them be reactive, because the turns where they're able to turn the corner are the ones where they get a free turn, where they can slam a dude, hold back a draw spell, make sure that they can sacrifice some stuff to get some card advantage, pick off a couple of creatures here or there, and really stall the board state for a turn or two while they, draw 4 to 6 cards and you're drawing 1 or 2. That's really going to shift the tide of most games, so you cannot afford a dead turn to let them get there. As far as decks to play into this, obviously Mono Black is a pretty reasonable matchup. You've got access to Defiles, which deal with their lands. They also deal with pretty much all of their creatures. You've got Bajuka Bog, as well as some Graveyard in Nihil Spellbomb coming in from the sideboard. You've got removal spells that hit just about everything relevant. You've got Chainer's Edicts to punish them for not having Frogmites. You've got lots of stuff. The only thing you really have to be careful of is being burnt out from the makeshift munitions and the Galv Blast in the late game. And with cards like Vampire Sovereign and Gary, you're not likely to really be that low on life total. You just have to be careful of how many snuff outs you play. Same can be said for the Turbo Terror matchup. The Turbo Terror matchup is very dicey into this deck and against this deck. So you need to be aware that if you can provide early pressure against them, you can absolutely pressure them out of the game. However, if they're able to turn the corner, they will draw more cards than you, and you have a similar number of resources. You've only got the 8 main deck creatures. Sometimes you've got 2 Augur of Bolas, but that's really not going to seal the deal here. You've got to maximize your 2 sets of 5/5s, and they've got to maximize their 2 sets of creatures. The big problem you'll run into from Turbo Terror is getting stonewalled with those 3/3 indestructibles, especially if they're able to get 2 of them off of a rebuy from a Blood Fountain or something along those lines, drawing both of them, in those cases. That's going to make the game exceptionally difficult for you, so you need a plan for that, especially if you have Agony Warps in the sideboard. You should be bringing them in this matchup. It doesn't seem intuitive, but Kenku is really the cornerstone of whether or not you win or lose, so be aware of that. In the red deck, when you're playing the red deck into this, you just can't really afford a turn to let up the gas. You can't have a slow turn against them. You really need to keep aggressive hands, and you need to pressure them very, very quickly. Make sure that those tapped lands hurt. The deck does have life gain. Like I said, Reckoner's Bargain is really important for that matchup, but you have to make them have it. And in a lot of cases, you can try to get them low so that they are forced to Reckoner's Bargain, and then you can kill them in response. So keep an eye out for those lines. Make sure you don't give them a chance to Reckoner's Bargain in response to stabilize your killing blow. Make sure that you put them in a position where they have to proactively Reckoner's Bargain, and then you're able to kill them over the top of it. So don't let them resolve that 7 life. You'll be just fine. In the Caugate matchup, the Caugate matchup for this deck is pretty difficult. Makeshift Munitions is basically a cheat code. However, your counterspells do come into play here. If you can keep the Kenku Artificers off the board, you have a clear avenue to victory in the air. Especially with the life gain that you get from your Sacred Cats, you're able to very effectively life gain out of their range and then kill them in the sky. You have to be very careful. Like I said, your counterspells are big here. You have to make sure you fight them over Makeshift Munitions. You have to make sure you fight them over Kenku Artificers. Keep them out of the air, keep the Makeshift Munitions off the board, and you'll be just fine. All right, guys, I think that wraps up our meta breakdown for beating the meta of Grixis Affinity. Hopefully this gives you some insights into how the deck works, how the deck operates, what it's trying to do, and how to target its weaknesses. I hope this helps. If you guys have any suggestions for future deck breakdowns for beating the meta, put them down in the comment section. Link me a deck list. I will absolutely take a look at them and do my best to break them down for you. Hope you guys are liking the series. Make sure you guys drop a like and a comment for the algorithm. Please sub to the YouTube channel if you haven't and you've gotten this far into the video already. I do hope that I am providing some value to you and that you sub to the channel for future videos and take a look at my set recaps. We have a new set review coming for Brothers War, which was just fully spoiled, so keep an eye out for that. And as usual, guys, goodbye forever. Unless I see you next time. Peace.